biopharma,
Yeah.
emerging biopharma,
What do you like
med
better?
tech.
Favorite.
Well, I did aerospace and mechanical engineering as a grad, so I've got a little sweeter spot in my heart for
Do I have is that a clicker? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you.
I always forget.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Happy, and not too hangry or anything like that. So I'm Luba Greenwood. I just flew in from Boston. I'm based in half the time, basically in Kendall Square in Boston area, and my main home office is in Basel in Switzerland. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me. So today, one of the things I'll be talking about is digital health, and I wanted to cover a little bit of strategy and how companies and strategic think about digital health. But before I get there, I do want to give a little bit of background on myself so that you see where I'm coming from. So I'm currently at Roche Diagnostics, and yes, in a big global company, looking at hundreds and hundreds of digital health companies, and really digital health companies that cover a whole wide of areas, and I'll go into the areas that they are. My background, however, before that, I was in venture capital, and in two types of venture capital firms. One that really starts companies, so really is more of an accelerator, incubator of companies, everything from digital health to biotech to diagnostics, and the other one more of a traditional side. So I've looked into how do investors really think about investing into digital health and investing into biotech and diagnostics and med device. Before that, I was with Pfizer, and before Pfizer, I actually started out as a scientist, and then as a lawyer. I was an IP litigator at a big firm for many years, and really saw how diagnostics, digital health, pharma, biotech looks from a regulatory and IP point of view. And that was the time, and taking that view really helped me look at digital health properly, really. Looking at digital health from the lens of IP, from the lens of regulatory, from the lens of healthcare, and from the lens of investors and also strategics and ultimate users, of course, who are patients. So before I begin, is everybody here excited about digital health? Good. Do you think that digital health is, and digital media and everything in digital, do you think it transformed our lives? Okay. So this is a good example. We all think that we got iPhones and everything has been transformed. Look, we're not even looking at each other, and our necks are going to be like this when we grow up, or when we grow old, we're walking like this. But what's interesting, if you actually look, there's some behaviors in us that haven't actually changed. And this is a very important point. We still do a lot of the same things that we did before. And this is really an important point for our discussion today, that when you're thinking about digital health, when you're thinking about where is the value in digital health, think back to these types of pictures, right? What is actually changing? What is providing value? What is actually changing the way that we see healthcare and the way that we experience healthcare? So this is when you ask, what is digital health? Okay, you have, and Tom, I know you're from a consulting firm, and I don't want to say all consulting firms, but consultants love giving us definitions of digital health, right? Because that's a great way of providing value, right? Here's what you need to do as a, and again, not extended, everybody, other smaller consultants, they say, I have a great thing for you. Hello, Roche, hello, Pfizer. You need to be looking into AI and deep learning. That is really what you need to do. And you say, really, what about real world data? I heard about that. The other consultant told me something about real world data. I'm really confused. And then they say, remote monitoring, that's something that you need to be thinking about. And again, there's so many definitions that anybody and everyone can be telling you about, and there are lots of exciting, beautiful, and I tried to mimic, I don't know if it's really came out beautiful, I tried to kind of show you what usually we on the strategic side see from consultants, right? These great definitions. And now the question is should we be thinking about definitions, or should we be actually thinking about the value? And where we like to think about is really forget about definitions and really start thinking about the landscape and the value that it brings to healthcare. So I have actually looked over, I think in this year, over hundreds of digital health companies. There has been, this is data from 2016, over 8 billion has been invested in over 500 digital health companies. And the key here is that the majority of investors are tech VCs. Does anybody think that that's a little odd? Is that normal that the majority are tech VCs and this is healthcare? Okay. Some smiles, that's a good thing. That's what I was trying to elicit, that's a good. Some laughs, that's even better. So the key is that the issue is when you have investors that are not familiar with the actual healthcare space and are not looking at digital health through the healthcare lens, you may actually not get the right companies that would provide value. So this is a real hurdle for a lot of the strategics. When you're out there, and investors, when you're out there, you're trying to figure out, okay, now that I've completely, too much noise with all the definitions, with all the names, I am pretty confused about what it is that I'm looking at. What's even more difficult is that the investors, the people that are really driving these companies, and the CEOs and a lot of the management do not come from healthcare. Now, when you look into the most funded categories, and this is a good example. So the number one, this is actually a great category, genomics and sequencing. So this actually includes also sequencing, sequencing machines, sequencers themselves, tertiary analysis, secondary analysis, all the bioinformatics, so that all goes into the first category. Now, the second category, analytics and big data, happy to go into that as well. That includes thinking about real-world evidence, AI. And then the third is wearable and biosensing. So this is the third most invested category and funded category. Now, my question is, this third most funded category, do you think it's a valuable one? How many think that this is very highly valuable and provides high return on investment? Okay, one person. Anybody else? Two people. Okay, good. All right. Well, three people. So that's great. Well, there's I hope that there are more people, right? Because this is the third most invested category. So you would think that it provides a lot of return on investment. Now, if you look at studies, so there's been funding in these in wearables, in biosensing for the last 3-4 years. If you actually look at data, this category does not provide any return on investment. There's some studies, and Rand did a study. There are a few other studies. I don't want to go too much into the studies, but there's quite a lot of evidence that it doesn't provide as much value as the other digital health opportunities. So, as I mentioned, very difficult in identifying opportunities because there's an identifying strategic goals. Internally as well as externally, there's a lot of noise out there. So the way that we've been looking into the strategy and really thinking of the strategy is we said, okay, there's a lot of investment from tech. There are a lot of companies out there. How can we really focus on identifying the right company of value? So this is what we looked at and came up with. You have to look at healthcare ecosystem, you have to look at the digital health companies through the lens of healthcare ecosystem. So what do you have in the healthcare ecosystem? You have regulation, right? And we all know now that many of these wearables and the data from wearables and other data, if you want, in big data analytics, AI, real-world data, all of that has to be actually regulated by the FDA, and there are various regulations. Then you look into reimbursement, patient need, whether or not this is an area of high unmet medical need, physician adoption, intellectual property, right? So these are the key areas to look through. And, okay. So when you look into the healthcare ecosystem and into digital health through a healthcare ecosystem, you come up with 3 buckets. Okay, so you basically come up with bucket 1. This is an area of digital health and digital opportunities, such as, for example, opportunities that enable better clinical design, opportunities for connectivity, data utilization, and this would include, for example, patient stratification tools, medtech wearables that enable better trial design protocols, EMR system, mobile apps. This area is really all the area for strategics. So this is for the customer. The customer is the company, right? The customer is not the patient here. And when you look through the healthcare ecosystem, you look at the regulation. Here's where the regulation is high risk. Reimbursement is pretty low risk. IP protection is low risk. And your competitors are really your direct competitors. So this is area one. Is anybody familiar with this area? Yeah? Are you in this area? You have a company in this area? Okay, very good. Because this is an area that's really of high value, right? This is an area that if you are a biotech company, you're going to be interested in these companies, right? When they come out of Matter, you're going to be interested in them, right? Because you are going to be, these are the companies that are going to make your products more efficient. These are the companies that are going to make your processes more efficient. These are the companies that your customers want, right? So number two, does Matter have this one? This is the patient engagement experience. This is the wearables. The three people that raised their hand that wearables are great and of high value would be very excited about this category, right? So this is the category where if you're looking through the healthcare ecosystem, reimbursement here is a high risk. And why is it a high risk? Because who's going to pay for it? Who's going to pay for you tracking your heartbeat or how much you're sleeping, if it is not, of course, linked to actual patient outcome and application for healthcare? If it's just for you, right? This is for your own personal experience to educate you. This is to educate the physician. This is the telemedicine and physician and patient interaction tools and portals. So this is where also regulatory, there's medium risk. Of course, there are some applications where you would need regulatory protection and others where you don't. And IP protection here is low risk. And this is the reason why actually tech investors love this space. They love it because there's no IP protection here. It doesn't really matter. What matters is how many users you've got. What matters is the interface that you have. What matters is, are you first to market? So this is an area loved and loved by investors. Again, tech investors, not healthcare investors that invest in biotech and med device and diagnostics, because this is really easy stuff to grasp. This is easy stuff for tech investors to understand, because this is the category that's very similar to tech. And actually, this is the category where you're strategic and you're a biotech or pharmaceutical company. You look at it, or a payer, you look at it and you say, why would I ever buy this company? Why would I want to actually integrate this? How am I going to integrate this? Do I even have these people? Is this an acqui-hire? What am I buying? This is basically an acqui-hire. I'm going to hire very, very brilliant people and put them somewhere in New Jersey, and they're going to leave in 2 weeks. And then what do I have? I don't have any of these capabilities internally. Are we on time? Oh, no, well, I'll go through third, and then we'll do questions, and then we'll, I think there's a way to do this. Okay. So the third area, this is the area that I'm most excited about. This is the area that will change healthcare. This is the area that will actually provide and truly provide healthcare value, right? Healthcare economic benefit. If you're thinking about healthcare, it's becoming more and more expensive. Drugs are becoming more and more expensive. We're all talking about precision medicine. This is the area that's actually giving you the precision medicine tools, giving you the healthcare economic value, and decreasing your overall cost of healthcare. So with that, I will keep this up. I want to be mindful of time. Should we start with questions? Okay, great.
Well, thank you, Luba.
Sure.
I think that was a provocative, I'm thinking, set of introductory remarks. And I noticed some grimaces and smiles, even to the side of me there, even though I was in the front row. So certainly we have a perspective at Accenture about some of those categories and what's going on in the marketplace. We'll talk a little bit about that. But maybe if we just we start with a higher level question. It kind of goes back to your notion of a healthcare investor versus a tech investor. So tell us a little bit about what you believe is the mindset of a healthcare investor, and really what are the elements that they're looking at as part of a digital health strategy?
Sure. So when you're a healthcare investor, you're thinking about some of those things that I mentioned, reimbursement and IP. And when you're investing, you want to make sure that you actually get some IP, that at the end of the day, you can transfer that IP. And that IP does not necessarily have to be patent, right? It could be tech transfer as well. So as a healthcare investor, you're always thinking about IP. You're also always thinking about one thing that many tech investors do not think about. And this is something that's very interesting. Sometimes I talk to tech investors, including tech VCs, who are, by the way, all extraordinarily brilliant people and really want to do the best for the healthcare. Sometimes I would have a conversation for about 15, 20 minutes, and the word patient is never uttered. When you're talking to healthcare companies, we are always talking about areas of high unmet medical need. We're talking about patients. We're talking about reimbursement, right? And these are the areas that when you're a healthcare investor, you're thinking, okay, let me think about the areas, what are the areas of high unmet medical need? And also another important thing, what about physician adoption? So physician adoption is something that I haven't mentioned, but that is on the slides, which is, again, you can have the greatest app, you can have the greatest healthcare IT device, but if it's not going to be incorporated and used by physicians, and it's also not part of medical workflow, it's not going to be adopted.
Great comments. Accenture recently put out, I think we've been doing this survey since about 2013, I think we started it, which is really the state of patient services, and there's a large digital health component to that. We just recently published the most recent, and to your point about physician adoption, one of our findings was in there that while patient services and some of these engagement, many of the things in that middle category you talked about are indeed providing some value. There's a lack of awareness and a lack of interjecting and bringing those to the marketplace as part and parcel with whether that be a therapy, whether that's a pill, an injectable, a diagnostic, whatever it's going out with. Talk to us a little bit about what folks in this room who are wanting to bring some of those things, how might they bring that to you differently so that they could affect that gap out there, this gap between awareness of how some of these engagement capabilities might be used?
Yeah, so I would, first of all, I would actually do quite a lot of homework. And I would really encourage doing a lot of homework and really thinking, and if you are, for example, working with one healthcare system, right? So let's say you're working with Mayo Clinic and you're working on collecting a certain data set. I would think about it a little more also globally. Okay, what is this data that you're collecting? How is it even cleansed? Is it the kind of data that you and look across, basically take a little bit of a step back and look across the whole healthcare, right? So what are the other, for example, sites that would need to collect that data? So think more, again, as in healthcare, right? Because if you're going to, let's say, run trials, you're going to run trials across, you're not just going to go to Mayo Clinic, right? You're going to go across multiple sites. So I would say the same thing. In order to fill the gap is really ask a lot of questions about across the entire health. So not just exactly what it is that you're doing, but also all those aspects that I just mentioned, right? Across healthcare, which is key things in healthcare. I would make sure that you have answers.
Great. I see some questions queuing up. I'm going to move to those here in a minute. I've got a couple of more, so if you guys want to continue to log, and then we'll get to some of the questions from the group. We have a point of view at Accenture that in this space with digital health, that today companies, the companies, the health tech investors, not the health, or I'm sorry, the health companies, not the tech investors, really need to broaden their view and narrow their focus. And by that, we mean digital can play in a lot more places than it was 2 years ago, 3 years ago, both in that company category that you focused on in your category 1 and this one that we have up here. But also narrowing the focus, which means being more specific about specific disease areas, therapeutic areas, et cetera, and being more in tune with the outcomes the patient needs, et cetera there. Can you comment a little bit about how you see that, or maybe even how Roche looks at kind of the nature of how this is evolving, both in terms of breadth of scope and the specificity of the things you're looking from folks in there?
You know, Tom, this is actually, thank you. It's a great question. And I don't want you to take away from this that healthcare companies, biotech and pharma and the payers, they have figured this out, right? This is in no way is saying that the pharmaceutical companies and the biotech companies knows exactly what it is that they want and know exactly what's going to provide. It will be the best, provide the best outcome for patients and healthcare as a whole. So one of the things that is limiting currently a lot of the strategics is the fact that they are much more reactive than they are proactive. And so when you're reactive, to your point, you can't sit down, you can't say, I want to go straight, and first of all, I want to look at everything. So as you said, be a little bit, take a step back and look at the whole space. And then in that space, identify exactly the areas where you as a strategic find the best value and go after those. So that is, because this is relatively new and jumping out at strategics, this is something that is currently being done within the pharmaceutical companies, but it hasn't been perfected yet, right? Because we're much more reactive, right? There are a lot of companies that are going up, and there are some that are actually make a lot of sense, right? So there are a few unicorns, right, that we have seen. They have very high valuations, and strategics all want to go and jump on those, and they want to get in on it. But when you're going in, you're jumping in, you're forgetting to take a step back and say, hold on a second, let's actually see, given our strategy, and that's what strategics are working on right now, but you don't see that playing out as much yet because it hasn't translated into the actual action of acquisition.
Interesting. I'm going to bridge over to, need to mic it differently here. All right. Let's move some of the questions that I'm seeing here. I'll start with a notion, and then we'll dig into a couple of the ones that look like they're bubbling up to the top. The notion of creating, your point about you know, the strategics, the health companies, the health and life sciences companies don't know everything there is to know, right? Which I think is good news for many of you out there. Talk to us about how the creation of a digital ecosystem fits into a strategy. Like, who do you need in that? Because if it's not all coming from within and you're not looking at just kind of transactions, what does that start to look like within some of the life sciences companies, diagnostics specifically?
How do you create internally, or how do you create an ecosystem?
What kind of partnerships? What are you creating in the marketplace to be able to really harness the talent, the ideas, the solutions that are out there versus it just being one-to-one transactions?
Yeah, so this is, for example, something that we're doing today, right, is going out there, and we're trying to go out as much as we can, and not just us, but all strategics. You see them going out there and having the discussion with entrepreneurs and with investors, right? We're starting to have a lot of those discussions with tech investors and trying to steer them and into the areas that actually much more of value to them, and they're very interested in those conversations. They want to know exactly what it is that the strategics are looking at and see as value. The same thing, payers. So we try to have as many conversations where the payers and also academics are involved. And then oh, can you hear me? All right. I try to project. So we try to have as many conversations and with entrepreneurs and trying to show them, here's how strategics think about this, right? Versus just, again, instead of being reactive, being more proactive. And so, for example, in the bucket 1, 2, and 3, you can clearly see, right? You can see that there's one bucket that is really about, you can make stuff. We will be very excited if you guys go and make stuff that's actually for companies. that make them more efficient, that help them with their trials, that they can compete with their competitors on trials, right? So if you can have better patient stratification, if you can get real world evidence that actually gives you a better drug and a drug that has less adverse events than the other drug that's maybe in the same stage of development, that is really quite valuable for healthcare companies. But that is very different. That value proposition is actually very different than in bucket 3, which is the value proposition of here is something that we can all work and create, and this is where more of payers have to be working together, and pharma and biotech and digital companies, and also the Googles and the GEs of the world, where we all have to work together to really create companies that are of amazing value, right? Value for patients that get the kind of drugs where you can have digital therapeutics, which is amazing. I saw a number of digital therapeutic companies in CNS space. If you can increase people's cognition with a video game rather than drugging them with a bunch of drugs that maybe slow them down and don't work, or if you can identify major depressive disorder or stop suicide, right? I mean, you can do so many wonderful things with digital therapeutics and digital diagnostics. And this is really in bucket 3, but we all have to work together and listen to each other and understand where the value comes from and how to build it and create it.
Great, excellent. Well, you hit almost every entity, I think, in the health ecosystem proper, the payers, right? The physicians, everybody that's in there, and then you went into some of the non-traditional folks. I heard the Googles, et cetera. So there's a cluster of questions around from the audience that says that maybe group as follows. Are non-traditional companies with strong digital technologies a real and imminent threat to life sciences companies?
No, actually, I don't think they're a real or imminent threat. I think they go very well in bucket 2, and it's a very important and a great bucket. And eventually, those companies could also create more platforms, right? So life sciences companies are not very good at building, and they can, but they're not as good at building platforms and as non-traditional players have always done that, right? Or for example, in AI, right? If you can have and apply some of that AI knowledge, and not just knowledge, but more of a platform where you can have a picture of health for somebody from an imaging machine, from a blood machine, from a sequencer, from looking at their searches, right, to understand their mental state, having an app that tracks their voice. Is it going up? Is it going down? Tracking their gait, how they walk. If you can combine that and actually have a real platform as a backbone for that, that is something that that the as you call non-traditional players are very good at and really would shine. But you need people to work together, because you want to not just have the digital and the backbone created, but you want to make sure that you're actually collecting the right data. And not just collecting the right data, and this is, again, non-traditional players very good at cleansing the data, duping the data, putting on a cloud, translating to a bunch of languages, making sure that they're privacy protected. There's so many wonderful things that non-traditional players are really very good at that they can do and provide. So absolutely. And also another thing is, in that bucket 1 and 3, where IP and regulation and reimbursement really matters, that is not to say that bucket 2 is not important. It's just not important for strategics. And it shouldn't be important for strategics, because it doesn't play to your strength. And it also is not, at the end of the day, what pharmaceutical and biotech companies are doing. It's not curing patients, right? But it is making processes more efficient. It is enabling patient experience. Those are all wonderful things about the overall patient experience.
Excellent. This notion of, so I'll take the corollary of and a recent development in the retail market with our friends at Amazon and Whole Foods has got every retailer running scared right now, thinking what's next, not to mention in our industry in life sciences, all the wholesalers thinking when that pivot happens. in those cases where that is a real threat from an outside entrant in the marketplace proper, you could argue that Amazon's been in the marketplace for a bit in retail. Those parallels, there's a lot of questions in here about those kind of threats. Theranos with their lab test targeting, right? How you view those kinds of things. Is there a space for them somewhere in here? Do you perceive that as a high risk versus an opportunity? So maybe you can talk about that space a little bit further than you did, but as it relates to risk versus opportunity.
This is for retail space.
Well, for in this case, those kinds of folks that are coming into your space for lab, for testing, the cost of sequencing dropping to nothing, et cetera. So it creates open space, right? It creates the ability for people to come in. So the questions in here on where do you put that on a risk to opportunity continuum, and how does a strategic look at those opportunities?
Yeah, so I think it's again, and Theranos is a good example of this, right? Which is it's not that easy to just make a blood test and go into your retail store, and it's wonderful, and strategics welcome this, of course. If you can go and you can make a company like Theranos and not really worry about regulatory approvals or whether or not or have any clinical validation, sure. But at the end of the day, you need clinical validation, and you would have to actually partner up with somebody in the medical field. It doesn't have to be strategic, right? But it could be a biotech or somebody that understands the actual clinical pathway. So I think it's interesting. I feel maybe I'm being more of a lawyer. I feel like that question answers itself by putting Theranos in there.
Yeah, it's coming from the audience. So I think it was a good seed. Let's think about the entrepreneurs here in the audience today, and let's say you run the gauntlet and they tell you a good story and they use the patient word when they come talk to you, and they're focused on outcomes, and they kind of get through kind of the web and really come to you with a healthcare lens to the solutions and things that they're bringing forward. What does it look like? What are some of the criteria, and how are companies like yours moving people from evaluation to piloting to scale? What does that process feel like, and what can they?
Yeah, so good question. So a lot of the companies, including Roche and all the pharmaceutical companies now have, and biotech companies now have either digital arms, or they have people that they have that are not just a few people that are sitting there, but people that can do true due diligence, also people that actually head the strategy for digital. So almost every single company now, almost every single strategic actually has those capabilities in-house. So the process actually is very similar to the process that you would go if you're a biotech company, for example. You go in, you talk to the right people. It's the same thing, right? So if you go in with an oncology product, you have to go into business development person that deals with oncology, and then they bring in a whole team. This is or if you're a GI, they'll bring in a GI team. So this is very similar. If you go in and you're a digital company, the one thing that could be, so they have you will go and do the same process. The only thing that would be helpful is if the entrepreneur looks into what exactly is that strategic trying to do. And that is very important, because sometimes, for example, if you're going in and you have an oncology-related, let's say, big data product, you may want to go to the oncology people rather than more of the big data, not the big data, but the digital health people. So look into, all strategics are very different, and all strategics value, as I mentioned, strategics are currently used to be in a very reactive state and are pulling back and trying to be more proactive. So try to figure out and ask questions about exactly what it is that they're interested in, what are their programs. Look into, for example, if you are in that bucket one and you are using real world evidence, big data, enabling clinical trials, look into what kind of clinical trials they're running currently and seeing what can be of help. If you are, let's say, in tertiary, in bioinformatics, tertiary review for genomics, you may want to go, for example, on the diagnostic side, but also you may want to go on a therapeutic side. It really depends on the company. But once you go through that diligence process, it is, again, very similar, right? Strategics have the capabilities to have the right people to conduct diligence. And if they don't, they often rely on wonderful consultants that help them to do that and run them. Yeah, quite in the network.
So you mentioned something there about kind of going in a particular area. It kind of lends this to this notion of narrowing focus, but so maybe going in instead of to the big data people to pitch it to the oncology team or something, because there's a use case there. A bit of our research around digital health and the opportunity there is we're seeing a lot of use cases where folks are stretching assets, investments, et cetera, across the portfolio, right? So things that were initially envisioned for critical heart failure are being stretched and using assets that were originally designed for diabetes or other disease areas. Talk a little bit about maybe how, if you like to see a bit more of a targeted entry point and you like to help folks kind of stretch those, whether you like them to come in with a use case and a broad vision, and then how you adopt that, but kind of what's the right way to approach that dichotomy of folks looking to squeeze as much out of the assets across a portfolio?
Yes, that's actually a really good question, and this is something that happens actually quite a bit, right? So, and it could backfire, because what happens is we have many companies that come in and they say, we have this amazing platform, and we can help you get to X, right? We can, for example, on the diagnostic side, we can help you with disease management across all diseases. Look, you're a diagnostic company, you're diagnosing a lot of diseases, diagnosing 5 diseases, will help you create this for 5 diseases. And by the way, we are now having a program across 20 more diseases, so we can do that. Isn't that great? So we have these amazing capabilities. So what does that say to a BD person inside a strategic? It immediately sends a red flag, which is not, wow, that's great, you guys can do a lot of really exciting things. It's that, wow, the valuation of this company is going to be quite high. Because I would like to bring this in, and this actually goes, and it depends which category you are, and this is the reason why it's separated into category 1 and category 3. If you're in category 1 and you're making a product, and some of them fall into 2, the same thing can fall into 2 categories. So for example, real world data can fall into first category and third category. If you are, for example, making a product that is for company only, not for ultimate, it's not digital therapeutic or digital diagnostic, you want to think about how do they view you, right? They view the digital health company as we have a need and we need to fill in this gap and we have a need for this particular product. And so therefore, and you have the best solution for it. So if you come with 10 or 20 more solutions on top of that for other things that the company doesn't have, the company is not really interested anymore, right? Because you're a wonderful company. You may be, you are wonderful. You have so many solutions, but the strategic just needs one of the 10 solutions. So that is sometimes, but however, if you're in bucket 3 and you can provide this amazing platform where you can stratify patient population across different indications, that's a great thing. So it really depends where you fit.
Okay, very good, thank you. 2 sets of questions because we're getting close to time here. I know you had to leave a little bit earlier today to get to another audience down the road. There's a set of questions that are really geared to some of the Matter member companies, right? So some of your peers in the industry, et cetera. And as you think about developing a digital health strategy, and you think about what's truly fundamental and important to that, I think you alluded to some of it in your opening comments. But what guidance and advice would you put forward to really shaping a digital health strategy from that lens, less our entrepreneurs, but some of the folks that are in your seat or in your peer companies?
So definitely some of the things that I mentioned before, right, is take a step back, and they're pretty much all strategics are currently reactive. And they may think that they're proactive within a certain space, and they'll say, okay, well, we're an oncology company, or we're a GI company, or we're a med tech or a surgical company for cardiovascular, and so that is exactly what we want to be focusing on. And we're thinking about it proactively. Not really. Most of them just think that they're doing it proactively, but it's more of reactive from what they see. I would say take a step back and really think about what it is that you want today. So the way that strategics are always thinking is, I have a portfolio today, and I have a bunch of gaps in the portfolio, and I need to fill them out today. Then in 3 years, I have to fill in large, it's not so much gaps, but there's certain needs in order to stay competitive that you have, okay? And that's in 3 years. And then here's the disruption. Here's what's coming, that it's going to come. It's going to be there, and it's going to hit you like you've never seen before. So today, companies are being proactive about that first little gap, the today, maybe a little bit in the next 3 years. But that bus that's coming in 10 years or 5 years or 7 years for some of them, and it's going to hit them and destroy them and basically wipe out some of their biggest products, that is something that companies, Roche of course does, but but many companies do think about that, but many companies do not think about that, some of the disruption that's coming. So I would definitely take a step back and be more proactive about disruption, be less critical. So once, and you know, the reason I say look at it through healthcare lens, it's not to actually be critical of the companies, but it's more to say that if you come into strategic and you say, listen, this is how I fit in regulation, this is how I fit in reimbursement, this is how I'm going to be adopted, and then they'll come and they'll say, well, I don't know. Well, and then you will be bolder and say, well, what's wrong, right? I mean, I've already showed you on your key value points, I've already showed you where I will bring value, and I've shown you that I thought this through this. So it would actually be much harder for strategics to come and push back because you're prepared.
Very good, thank you. I'm going to go close with one last one, which I'll try to make an amalgamation of a handful of the questions around the same space. I think you struck a chord with category 2 and a proclamation that maybe there's not a lot of value or as great a return on investment as the other categories, I think was what your slides actually said. Can you talk a little bit about how you see the value? How could folks pivot some of the things that they may be working on in that category, whether it's medication and adherence, apps for patient engagement, there's questions on the wearable side of those things. How do they turn it to create the value? I mean, it's hard to ignore that big amount of funding that's sitting out there. And how do we turn that into something of value to companies like yours and ultimately to patients? And then maybe as an example, is there something that you and your company in that space have tried and kind of turned it into something that actually you believe is working or is creating some more value, or something that you tried and you kind of left it by the wayside? So make it a little bit personal to kind of your organization, if you can share.
Yeah, sure. I don't want to go too personal, but
Sure.
but generally on the wearables, I think it is an exciting area, and you do see a lot of wearables currently that are actually used not to inform people. I'm not saying patients. I'm specifically not saying patients. I'm saying it's informing people. That's a very different area than try to pivot into bucket 2 or bucket 3 or bucket 1. Right, pivot to the same thing with adherence. If you're thinking about patient adherence, think about it from the lens of a pharmaceutical company. Okay, what are you trying to do? You want to make sure that your drugs are more effective, right? Is it that you're making really something for just because it's a cool technology, or really thinking about it more through the healthcare lens? Wearables, we actually see a lot of those investments that went into wearables and sensors. The investors are smart and companies are smart. They already started pivoting it into the bucket 3, right? They're already starting moving it into tracking, for example, for real-world data, right, where they're collecting real-world evidence for patients that are currently undergoing clinical trials. So if you are in that space, and pivoted to that. However, I do want to say, bucket 2 is still a valuable bucket. And if your ultimate exit strategy is to either become the best, sort of I would say, the Google of wearables, of wear tech, cool wear tech, that's great. Or if your ultimate exit is to be actually acquired by a non-therapeutic company, then that's great too, right? But that's a very different thing, because if that's your goal, then forget about looking at outcomes. Forget about thinking about IP. If you don't have any IP, you have open source, that's fine, that's great. If you're the first to market, you have lots of users, you have great interface and better interface than anybody else has, you're faster, better, that's great, do it. But that's not really a healthcare company type of play.
Very good. Well, I'd like to have you join me in thanking Luba for joining us. I think certainly some food for thought, some provocative points of view, and hopefully some insights. I know I took several away from the time together. So thank you for joining us, and I'm sure we'll see you at the next step in the series, right? All right. Very good. Thanks again.